Hey guys, I hope everybody is doing really well. Kind of hard to believe the semester is almost over. It goes pretty quickly with these mini classes. So I just wanted to throw out a brief video here, kind of highlighting what was going on with our assignments and discussion board post. Hopefully, you guys are able to see your feedback for all those assignments. We just transferred to a new version of Sakai, so there's a few kinks there. So if you can't view those, please let me know and I'll make sure everything's open and available for you to see your grades and the feedback I gave. But what I'm going to do now is just go through these problems in general, just to give you a little heads up, little additional information about some of the concepts you might see on your final exam. So, of course, each week we had a discussion forum and an assignment, and usually those were linked to either readings or videos that dealt with some concepts from the class, and they really kind of focused on some real world application of these concepts. So what I first want to do is look at some of the assignments, and we'll look at this one. They had the pretty interesting video, the Indiana Jones one, where they talked about supply and demand, did some introductory commentary there, and kind of applied it to what was going on with the hypothetical situation from the Indiana Jones movie. So we had a situation in the video where we were looking at two rival products, and we call these substitutes. So we were looking at pet snakes and pet monkeys. So the idea behind this in the setup to the video was people are going to either buy one or the other. So the snakes could be used as a substitute for monkeys and vice versa. So you could think of some other products out there. Pepsi and Coke are good examples. A couple of you guys had mentioned through some of your problems. There are products that can be used interchangeably. All right, maybe a pen and a pencil, they could be used interchangeably. We call these products substitutes. So what goes on with the demand and the price for one substitute affects the other good. So this whole assignment's kind of getting into that relationship. So the first question asked, what effect did the growing popularity of pet monkeys have on the demand for snakes? So for whatever reason, people want to buy more pet monkeys. We're making this assumption these two goods are substitutes. Whether that really holds in reality is something else altogether, but we're making that assumption in this problem. So if people are buying more monkeys, that means they're going to be buying less snakes because they're going to buy one or the other. So what happens when the popularity of monkeys goes up? People buy less snakes. All right, so if less snakes are being purchased, that's a reduction in demand. So the questions in this assignment kind of had you think about these concepts that we talked about in our text and in the videos that I created on supply and demand, and kind of brought that together with the information from the video. So let's take a look at how that works out with the supply and demand diagrams. I know sometimes it gets a little bit tricky trying to understand these concepts, especially with an online class. I think it's good to kind of get a review of seeing how this all plays out. So these supply and demand diagrams always start the same way. We have this little X, all right, and the upward sloping curve, that's your supply, and I just call that S1 to show that's the initial supply. And the downward sloping curve is your demand D1. The reason demand is downward sloping is as prices go down, people will buy more of a product. As prices go up, typically they buy less. All right, price is on this axis, and quantity is down here on the horizontal axis. And hopefully my pen will work well enough that we can kind of get an idea of what's going on here. So what we do with all these examples is start with an initial price, we call that P1, and an initial quantity, Q1. So those are equilibrium levels. So right now we're looking at the demand, let's say, for snakes. All right, so let's say this initial price, this P1 was the price, the average price of a snake, all right, before there was this surge in popularity for monkeys. The Q1 stood for how many snakes were being sold before the surge in popularity for monkeys. And sometimes it helps to visualize this with real numbers. So let's say before the change that snakes were selling for $100 a piece, that was the initial price, and maybe 1,000 were sold per year, let's say. And all of a sudden, for whatever reason, maybe there's there's a cool movie where monkeys are in the movie and people watch this movie and a bunch of people now want to buy pet monkeys. That's the cool thing to do. Well, more people are buying pet monkeys. We said snakes were a substitute, so that means you're going to buy one or the other. Less people are buying snakes. So like we talked about, demand goes down. All right, so this is what we meant by a change in demand. Some factor caused demand for snakes to change. People aren't willing to buy as many snakes at a given price as they were before. All right, so that demand changed. We have what we call a new equilibrium point. So we want to figure out what happened with price and what happened with quantity. All right, I didn't give you any numbers when I asked the question originally. I'm just throwing in numbers to make sense of it. I just asked you, what was the change in direction for price and quantity? Well, we see price and quantity both go down. The reason is we're getting closer to zero, right? Zero is the start of the axis. All right, so the price was 100 originally. Well, people are buying less snakes because monkeys are more popular. I don't know what the price went down to, but it went down, let's just say, to visualize it, it went down to 80. That's our new equilibrium price. Again, I don't know what the exact quantity went down to. I just know by the change in the direction of the curve, it went down. So let's say, all right, quantity went down to like 700. The whole idea there is price and quantity goes down for snakes because people are buying less of them. That makes sense. If people are buying less of a good, all right, companies, firms, stores usually have to lower prices to get people to buy that good. So that's what's going on in this case. So that was what we call a change in demand. If you're still a little bit confused by that, go back, watch the Indiana Jones clip again. I have a whole video where I go through this in a lot of detail in the first week's notes. So you can click on that video and there's like half an hour, 45 minutes of me going through this in detail. But that's the whole idea there of what was going on. So price went down, quantity went down because the demand decreased. Demand kind of moved down to the left for the snakes. So that covered the first three questions there. Basically, that was all kind of incorporated in that graph I just did. Question number 4, the technical term is substitutes for this relationship. So I don't know if they directly talked about that in the video, but they discussed that in your book. So that was kind of a question you needed to do a little research from your book to get. So anytime we use products interchangeably, they're substitutes. There's some products we use with each other. All right, so if you make if you enjoy peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, when you buy peanut butter, you buy jelly, you use them together. Those are complements. If you pick up a new sport, maybe you start playing tennis, you're going to buy a tennis racket and you're going to buy tennis balls, all right? The racket and the balls, those are complementary goods. They go together. The monkeys and snakes, they were kind of opposites. You use one or the other. Those are substitutes. All right, so you guys gave me some good examples of different goods from your personal lives that you use as substitutes. Again, Coke and Pepsi is kind of the classic example that we see with that. Butter and margarine, there's a couple other examples that you see a lot in economics textbooks, goods that can kind of be used in place of one another. The last question is asking, what happens to the demand for pet snakes if the rodent population increases? So now this is kind of an opposite case. With the monkeys increasing, or the popularity of monkeys increasing, we were buying less snakes because those were substitute goods. The rodents is a different situation. Now we're not talking about a substitute for a snake. We're talking about something that might cause you to buy a snake. In the video, we talked about how much Indiana Jones hates snakes, right? But even Indy might buy a snake if his house was infested with rodents because the snake goes around and kills the rodents. So we expect when there's this outbreak of rodents, people are more likely to buy pet snakes. At least that's the logic that was given to us in our video. So kind of same idea. If we look at that diagram, it's going to be set up the same way. All right, it's just a different scenario. And again, let's just mark snakes down here so we know what product we're talking about. And we have an initial price. I'm not going to throw out any numbers this time. But again, that supply curve upward sloping. And the reason the supply curve is upward sloping, companies will produce more of a good generally if they can get a higher price for their good. The exact opposite of what we see with consumers. So there's this rodent outbreak. Well, people are going to buy more pet snakes, that means demand goes up. All right, and we see, you just plot that new equilibrium point, come over, see where it intersects with the axis, vertical axis there, horizontal axis here. Notice quantity went up. We're selling more snakes because people want to buy more snakes. It's a more popular good. Price goes up. So that's really the whole basics that underlie supply and demand there. If we go back, and I'm actually going to switch up and go to the forum right now because the question we had in week 1 for the forum is kind of closely related to what we just seen there. So let's bring this up. And I was basically asking you guys for the difference between a change in demand and a change in quantity demanded. So what we've seen in these examples here was a change in demand, right? Our demand actually moved. In one case, the demand went up. The reason was people are buying more snakes because there's this rodent infestation. In the first case, people are buying less snakes because monkeys are now more popular. So 2 different reasons, but in both cases, demand changed. People are buying more or less of a good at a given price. All right, so a change in quantity demanded means you're willing to buy just as much as you were yesterday or last week at a given price, but the price in the market changed, so you buy more or less. That's a different situation. Your demand, which is your willingness to buy something at a given price, that didn't change, but the price in the market changed. Well, if your willingness to buy it didn't change, your demand didn't change, that means the demand curve did not move. The supply curve had to have moved. All right, so if we go here and let me open up a new file, we'll show what that looks like when the supply curve moves. All right, so again, we got our supply and our demand. Let's say supply goes down for some reason. So that's a reduction in supply. I'm just starting with those same basic points, P1 and Q1. All right, we have a new equilibrium point. Price goes up, quantity goes down. Notice something happened with suppliers. All right, they're supplying less of a good for whatever reason. If this is maybe the market for corn, let's say there's a drought, there's less corn being produced, the supply goes down. Notice people's demand for corn didn't change. We still have one demand curve, all right? That curve didn't move. People are willing to buy as much corn as they would in the past at a given price, but the price went up because something happened on the supply side. All right, so we shifted along the demand curve from one point to another. That's called a change in quantity demanded. We had a change in supply, but a change in quantity demanded. So if the curve itself moves, like with the supply curve, change in supply, the demand curve didn't move, so it's not a change in demand, it's a change in quantity demanded. I know that's kind of technical, people get tripped up on that, so just kind of go back to your book and your videos, kind of review that if you're still not getting that. And just to go back to what we did earlier, notice, like we said, that was a change in demand because the curve actually moved from one curve to another. We had a change in quantity supplied here. Not a change in supply. The supply curve didn't move. Suppliers are willing to produce as much as they did in the past, but the curve for demand moved, so we kind of shifted down along the supply curve to a new point. That's a change in quantity supplied. So rewatch this video if you're not getting it. Watch those other videos I put out there. If you're still having trouble with that, let me know. I made notes in your assignments and forum posts kind of directing you if you got that wrong initially, but just let me know if you're not getting that. I wanted to spend most of the time on this review on that concept because I think that's one of the trickier things that people try to grasp when they're learning about this subject. But just to quickly go through some of these other assignments that are kind of less technical, monopolies and elasticity, we talked about that in week 2. I was asking you guys about a product that you actually use that's a monopoly. So a couple of you noted that your electric service, Athens Utility Board, you purchase your electricity from them, you're kind of stuck with them. Now, it's rare that a good's a strict monopoly, even in the case of something like a utility board, which is pretty much the standard definition of a monopoly. There are some alternatives. You could buy a generator for your house. You could put up solar panels. There's other things you could do, but that's pretty much a monopoly. They don't have any real competition. They're the major producer in their industry. So if you purchase it from them, you're kind of stuck with it. And if they raise prices, you're kind of stuck. So typically goods that are produced by monopolies, you don't have much discretion to change your purchases. You can't go somewhere else to buy it. So you have kind of a lower elasticity of demand, meaning you can't really react that very strongly to price changes. If you have a high elasticity of demand, that means you react strongly to price changes. Maybe the price goes up 5%, you reduce your consumption 30%. That's highly elastic demand. Highly inelastic demand would be like prices go up 50%, but you only reduce your consumption by 3%. You don't respond very strongly to that change in price. So that was the whole idea behind the monopolies and elasticities. Those problems, or those concepts, I should say, are kind of closely related. Externalities, just basically an externality is when something that a third party creates has an effect on you. So one of the more popular externalities, and a couple of you guys noted this in your work, is pollution. Right, whether it's noise pollution, somebody playing their music too loud, or typical pollution in the atmosphere from cars or from factories or whatnot. So it's something produced by somebody else, but you feel the effects of it. So that's a negative externality. There's also positive externalities. So sometimes you can get the benefit of somebody else's production or behavior without paying for it. So for instance, a fireworks display. Maybe your neighbors are shooting off fireworks in their backyard over the 4th of July, and they spend hundreds of dollars, and you get to sit back and take it all in, and you enjoy the fireworks display. You don't pay for it. That's a positive externality. And of course, it's kind of subjective. If you don't like fireworks and your neighbors are lighting off fireworks at 2 in the morning, that actually could be noise pollution, and it's a negative externality. So it really, you kind of have to look at the particular context of these sorts of situations. A few years back, I was living at the beach. I lived a couple blocks behind the beach, and I had a house where there was an empty lot in front of my backyard between me and the beach. Then there was an alleyway, then there was a public access to the beach. So basically, there was no homes blocking my view of the ocean. So I kind of had an obstructed view of the beach and the ocean, even though I lived 2 blocks behind it. So that was a great positive externality for me. I was paying the same amount other people had paid on my block. Most other people didn't have the view of the beach because we were so far back. Just because of circumstance and luck, I got to enjoy the beach. That's a positive externality. I got that view even though I didn't have to pay for it. On the flip side, right before I was getting ready to leave that house, and I was renting the house at the time when I was out there, they started building a restaurant right behind our home. And when they were constructing that, not only was there noise pollution from the construction, that was a negative externality, but they're also blocking the view. So that was an example of a negative externality. So it really depends on the situation. And what we talked about with these problems was, how do you deal with externalities? Sometimes the government gets involved to be able to deal with these. I think a couple of you guys talked about scenarios where you had noise pollution. You may have handled it by talking to your neighbor, your friend, telling them to turn it down. Others of you had to resort to going to the police and bringing the government authorities in. So again, it depends on the different situations. Typically, we like the government to stay out of it, and we'd rather handle it on our own if possible. But in some cases, you do need the third party, in this case the government, to come in and kind of mediate and deal with that externality. All right, so let's just quickly look at the assignments for week 2 and week 3 here. We had an assignment on monopolies, just like we had a discussion board form, and this one dealt with a video on Luxottica and Standard Oil, and I think these are really interesting examples. They're from very different time periods, of course. Luxottica is, a company that we have today that's still operating, whereas Standard Oil, that was over 100 years ago or so that they were in operation. Although when Standard Oil was broken up, I think it was broken into like 23 or 25 different smaller companies. Some of those still exist. I think Mobil Oil might have been one of them. Exxon actually might have been part of Standard Oil at one point. So Standard Oil got so large that the government kind of brought suit against it. They filed an antitrust suit, basically saying that the company was so large it was bad for consumers. They busted up the company into these 20 or so smaller companies, which some of them still operate today. So the whole idea behind that was to protect consumers. So going into the questions, Luxottica and Standard Oil both got their advantages kind of in some similar ways. They kind of took over the competition or took down the competition, and that gave them significant advantages. It's interesting to watch Rockefeller, some of the underhanded techniques that he used to take over the oil industry. They talked about the idea that he went out and bought all of the barrels that you store oil in so his competitors couldn't bring their oil to market. I think he bought the train lines so they couldn't take the product to market. So he used a lot of very interesting techniques, some might say unethical, to get his market dominance. Luxottica, maybe they didn't do things that were necessarily as unethical, but in both cases it ended up creating monopolies that were kind of bad for consumers. So the idea behind a monopoly is that, if you don't have competition, these companies don't have an incentive to compete on price. They don't necessarily have to offer lower prices, so consumers are hurt. We like competition in the economy. Going down to number 3, just that kind of gets that idea that if we have one company that dominates an industry, you don't have as much choice, obviously, and as a consumer, you're kind of stuck with that price. And the government has a bunch of different techniques or methods at their disposal to try to prevent monopolies. Antitrust laws are the ones that are most prominent. Basically, these are laws on the books that lets the government basically break up a company if it becomes too large or prevent it from forming in the first place. So sometimes you see companies that want to merge, they have to get the approval of the government to do this if they get to a critical mass that they're so large that the government thinks the formation of that one single company is going to adversely affect competition and conceivably hurt consumers. So the very last assignment that we looked at in week number 3 was dealing with income inequality, a really huge issue, not just within the United States, but that is faced throughout many countries within the world. So we watched a short video talking about some of the issues regarding income inequality. And basically the whole idea, just not even to delve into individual questions here, but the whole idea behind income inequality is there's a growing gap between the rich and the poor. And it's increasingly more difficult for people in the less wealthy classes of the United States to kind of get ahead. And so the question is, what should we do? And I think first off, a question is, should the government do anything about this? Some people have a very libertarian approach, meaning they don't like the government to get involved in economic matters unless it's really extremely necessary. So some folks would say, well, this isn't the government's business at all. Others might say that, yeah, the government has a role to play, but they might disagree with what exactly the government should do. So the question is, what should we do if we feel that there is a need for the government to address this growing inequality, which more and more economists, as the problems got worse over recent years, have kind of stepped up and said, yeah, we should do something about this, but a lot of disagreements about exactly what could be done. So you guys gave some great feedback as to your own personal views on this. So for question number 4, I was asking you, in particular, what do you think should be done? So there wasn't necessarily a right or wrong answer for that. Some of you guys noted that the minimum wage could be raised. So this would help people that are making the minimum wage right now. So that would help to close the gap to some small extent from that perspective. There's some downsides to that, though. If those folks that were making $7.25 an hour now make $10 an hour, that's great for them. That helps them. But that's hard for some business owners. So maybe they wouldn't be able to hire as many people as they would otherwise. So that's a downside of that potential policy. Also, it may cause inflation, meaning if companies are now paying their workers more, they're going to pass on those increased prices to their consumers. So that's not to say that raising the minimum wage is bad, or I'm not necessarily advocating for it. I'm just saying you have to take those considerations into account. So that is one way we could address inequality, but it has some drawbacks. And any potential solution is going to be complex, and there's going to be pros and cons you have to take into consideration when we're kind of debating these ideas or putting proposals out there to help solve a huge problem like this. Another potential solution is for more spending or improvements to the education system to make it easier for people to access higher education or to improve education before we even get to that level. Because the whole idea behind that is when people have more skills, they're more marketable, they're more productive, and this helps them earn greater incomes. So that could help to lessen that gap between the rich and the poor. And again, there's pros and cons regarding that. I think most people would like to see increased access to higher education and better education at the K through 12 levels, but how do we do that? What are the costs associated with that? There's a lot of debate about that. Another idea that is out there that I think could really work in the future, it's maybe not discussed as much as raising the minimum wage or trying to provide more access to education, but is giving companies incentives to hire people. So the idea could be we could have tax incentives, tax breaks for companies that hire new employees. Maybe for companies that hire employees making a certain wage level, the government could give a $1,000 or $5,000 tax break, let's just say, for instance. If we do this, this gives companies incentives to hire people, that raises wages. Now, that would have to be financed, so how do we come up with that tax? How do we come up with the money to pay for those tax credits? Well, you may have to raise taxes somewhere else or cut spending elsewhere to be able to do that. So another interesting idea. There's a lot of possibilities out there. You guys did a great job coming up with some of your own ideas. I'm sure this is a big economic issue you'll be seeing more about in coming years. So this is an introductory economics class, so we're just touching on some of the basic stuff. I encourage you guys, though, to go out there, read more about this, learn more about this, and share your ideas with others. That's how we solve problems, working together, talking through the various solutions for these problems. So that basically wraps up what I wanted to do with the review here. I posted some narrated PowerPoint notes going through individual problems that some students had questions about. So those are all housed in the week number 4 module, so you can go back and look through those. Please let me know if you have any questions about the final. And again, the final exam's covering those first 15 chapters we covered, not chapters 1 through 15, but the first 15 chapters we covered weeks 1 through 3. You have an hour, 15 minutes to work on the exam. It's open book, open note. You use your calculator, but please make sure you do your own work. The requirements for our final project are also out there. And I just wanted to note there's 3 bonus quizzes that are now open. You can't hurt your grade by taking those quizzes. So if you take those quizzes and you bomb them, they just go away. I use those 3 quizzes in place of your lowest 3 quiz scores. All right, so if you take the bonus 3 quizzes and those are the worst 3 quizzes you took, they just go away. If you do really good on one of them but not so well on the next 2, I just use the best one in place of a worse score. So if you just wanted to take 1 or 2 of the bonus quizzes instead of 3, that's fine. You're not required to do any at all, but it's an option out there to help your grade out. So please let me know if you have any questions about any of the material we covered or any of the final assignments we have over the last few days of the class. And I wish you the best of luck and have a great summer.